totally surprised.
Hello, we're about to begin. Before we start our seminar, I'd like to just get a couple of housekeeping items out of the way. The major exits are right behind you and to your very left, and restrooms are on the west side of the main hall on the I Street portion of the building. For the webcast viewers, we very much encourage you to send your emails to the address that you see on the bottom. That's SIERRA@calepa.ca.gov.
All right, so I'm going to just briefly introduce David Gershon, who's here today to give us a seminar about how to empower citizens to adopt low-carbon lifestyles. Obviously, the Air Resources Board is working a lot on low-carbon activities, and we're really interested in seeing David's thoughts on how to really engage the citizens of California and elsewhere in this effort. So he is the founder and CEO of the Empowerment Institute and has done a tremendous amount of research on behavior change and large system transformation. And he applies that work to issues on communities, organizational, and social change scales. He works with cities, government agencies, large organizations, and social entrepreneurs to address a wide variety of issues, including low-carbon lifestyles, which is what he will be talking about today, but also livable neighborhoods and sustainable communities. And over the past 30 years, the programs that he's worked on empowerment have designed and he's won many awards, including recently being acknowledged by a major academic research study as being unsurpassed in behavior change. David Gershon is also the author of 11 books, including the recently published Social Change 2.0, a blueprint for reinventing our world, which won the National Best Book Award. And of course, the probably widely known Low Carbon Diet book, a 30-day program to lose 5,000 pounds, which I have a copy of right here. And he co-directs the Empowerment Institute's School for Transformative Social Change, which empowers social entrepreneurs and change agents from around the world to design and implement cutting-edge social innovations. So we're very pleased to welcome David here today to teach us more about his work empowering citizens to adopt low-carbon lifestyles. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, it is an honor and a pleasure. Let me see if I got my system turned on. I think I did. Bear with me one moment. Is this better? Can you hear me any better now? Thanks. So it is an honor and a pleasure to be here, the land of social innovation, the land of let's change the world, let's make this world a better place. I've already seen many experiences of that since I've been here in the last 24 hours. Saw your Tesla this morning, which is an inspiring car, and it's so beautiful as well. So let me cut to the chase. What we need to do is we literally do need to change the world because the current trajectory we're on is unsustainable, and we are hitting tipping points that once we cross, we don't get to go back over again. Climate change is the issue of our time. And what I want to propose is that there is a way forward that can include engaging citizens and communities as a driver of the kind of large system transformation that's needed to address this large, complex issue. And that's a bold statement. And I want to share with you what gives me some confidence that we might be able to make that kind of change happen from the bottom up. So I want to specifically talk to the strategies and tools that we've built over the last couple of decades. And when one deploys them in the space of carbon reduction, starts to generate a reinvention process in our cities. So this is one of my favorite quotes. It's so important to me. I have it on my bathroom when I go in the middle of my day to need inspiration. In my dream, the angel shrugged and said, if we fail this time, it will be a failure of imagination. And then she placed the world gently in the palm of my hand. And that is the world we live in right now, a world that needs bold thinking and needs people to take that level of responsibility. So the big question before we get into the how and the why of reducing our carbon footprint as individuals is why bother? Is there not an easier way to go? This is a lot of work to change people's behavior. Might there not be an easier solution? And the starting point is it is the low-hanging fruit. We've seen what happens when we try national legislation to get carbon legislation addressed and how hard it is. We've seen it even in your state, how hard it is to move people from the legislation into behavioral change. But here's why it is the low-hanging fruit, aside from the fact that legislation has a hard road to hoe. 50 to 90% of a community's carbon footprint is the residential sector. In America, it's up to 50%, and by some standards, Chris Jones's standards, it could be as high as 75 or 85% of America's footprint. It is where the carbon is. It is also available to us because through energy efficiency, we can start to make these changes. So reducing our carbon footprint is, in fact, the low-hanging fruit. But the second thing is cities is where the carbon is. So if you can engage citizens in our cities to reduce their carbon footprint and scale, a lot of ifs, you have the potential to make an impact on this issue. And that's where we've started to do our work over the last bunch of years. So the question then is, so how do we do this? If in fact it's available to us, if in fact it's a lever for change, how do we do it? So here's how behavior change has traditionally been addressed. One is awareness and information campaigns. The belief is that if you raise awareness, if you give people information, they will change. How many of you know all the things, and well, this is EPA, so you probably know all the things. But how many of you who know all the things have done all the things that you should be doing? Probably not that many, certainly not in my experience. And in the most progressive cities where I work, there's a big gap between awareness and behavior change. Awareness does not change behavior. Awareness generates awareness. So that by itself isn't going to get the job done. Command and control, passing legislation. We've been talking this morning with a number of you about the kinds of legislation, the most progressive legislation that I've seen in this country, and how hard it is to get people to act on that. By passing a law, it doesn't necessarily get it implemented. So command and control by itself as a way to change behavior, and particularly if you take it down to the individual level, it's a really hard sell. Not to say you don't need it at the state level, at the city level, but at the local individual level, it's hard to change behavior based on a law. Financial incentives, there's a lot of research that's been shown that we are not rational actors as economists have made us out to be. We are, in the field of behavioral economics, talks a lot about this. We make decisions for very different reasons than maximization of utility. So financial incentives are based on assuming that people will look for the utility of a decision, and that's not how people make decisions, generally speaking. They can reinforce, but by themselves, they can't get us across the finish line. And most of you know that by virtue of just observing what has been happening. The last one is probably less known. I call it monocultural thinking. It's a way of approaching behavior change by single issue and single agency. And we as individuals don't relate to an agency saying change this behavior. We have different motivations for why we change behavior. And most of them are not based on what an agency or a single action coming at us has as its target. So we need to begin to think more out of the box. We need to start thinking creatively about the process of behavior change. We can't get there based on what has been done in the past, or we would have gotten there already. So The question then is, how do we get out of the box? And are there any clues of how to get out of the box? So I want to share some of the clues that we've discovered and begun to put into operation. I can't suggest that we had these clues in mind when we started. It's more after the fact. So the first is a systems, natural systems clue. When a system in the evolution of our planet reached a point where life on this planet could no longer achieve its goals as a single-cell organism, it created something called a multicellular organism. When you need to organize life at a higher level of complexity, you need to move from single to multicellular organisms. Getting an individual to change their behavior is a very complex task. Getting many individuals to change their behavior is a complex task. So one of the clues is, can we use this notion that comes out of evolution of building multicellular organisms to create the support, the complexity needed to manage that level of change? So a clue. Another clue from social systems is the fact that 1 out of every 10 people on our planet is on Facebook. What does that tell us about the need for social connectivity that's available to us? A third clue, an anthropologist's clue, Margaret Mead, I'm sure you all know this quote. Any community organizer or change the world type has this one embedded somewhere in their psyche. Never doubt that a small group of people, small group of committed individuals can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. The power of a small group. We're seeing that happen right now in the Occupy Wall Street phenomena. One example of many where small groups begin to start creating shifts. So getting people organized in small groups. So the question in front of us, as I see it, in terms of getting out of the box around the behavior change and reduction of our carbon footprint is, how do we harness this evolutionary impulse for greater social connection and the power of small groups to address the climate change crisis? So what I want to share with you is a 2-decade journey of the possible. 4 distinct applications where we began to apply this. And then I want to move you towards our experience in how to get cities to actually make an impact and a dent, and where we're trying to take this in terms of a game changer around carbon reduction in cities. So our journey began in 1990. In 1992, we got confirmation of the track that we were on was valid. When we discovered that in the Rio summit in 1992, the major conclusion was that the greatest cause of the deterioration of our global ecosystem was the unsustainable patterns of consumption and production in the industrialized countries, which seems common knowledge right now. But this was not the norm in thinking in 1992. That was the place that we decided to target our work. How do we target unsustainable patterns of consumption in the industrialized world? A challenge that needed to be tackled with our background, my background in behavior change and our Empowerment Institute's work over a decade of research before that. We felt we could probably tackle this issue with our knowledge base. So we had 3 questions that we set up, which were our core learning objectives. How do we get people to adopt environmentally sustainable lifestyles? This was the time of 50 simple things, or 350 simple things, but people were not acting on their good intention. If you were able to get people to change their behavior, could you sustain it over time? Was this actually something that could get traction and be sustainable, as in sustainable lifestyle? And then the last thing was, how can you take a process like this to scale? And 10 years worth of research is really what it took us to answer those questions. So I wrote a book called The Green Living Handbook. Some of you may know it. It was a former incarnation called the Eco Team Handbook. And what we did is we took the overwhelm of information at the time. We broke into 6 topics: reducing solid waste, water efficiency, energy efficiency, water efficiency, transportation efficiency, I think I may have repeated one here, and green purchasing. And we got people involved, and we began to see if the overall information organized into simple recipes could enable people to actually make these changes. And what we concluded was it couldn't. That it was the state-of-the-art behavior change program, but a piece was missing. And that piece was a peer support group, which we came to call an eco team. And when we put all those pieces together, a peer support group, highly structured program, we got these results from some 20,000 people. Substantial results that answered the first question: could you get people to substantially reduce their environmental impact? And the answer was we could. The second question, though, that was upon us was it sustained over time? Could you get it actually sustained over time? Or would people recede and go back to their old way of conducting their lifestyles? And we had 7 longitudinal studies done. Many of the cities that hired us wanted to see if this was a good investment. In one of the countries where it diffused, the Netherlands, we had a 2-year longitudinal study. And what we got out of those studies was that the behavior was sustained. 53% of the people transferred to their workplace, so it began to actually have high leverage beyond just their own households. We found that on average 24 actions were taken during the program, and 2 years later they were sustained and new actions were added, and 1 action was dropped off. So by the standards of these studies, it was determined that this particular approach, peer support group, the structured process that I will tell you more about, was able to change behavior and sustain it over time. So the third question we had to answer, and again, this sounds so symmetrical, just very simple. I mean, there was many, many, many dead ends and much learning. The key to all of this is iterative learning. Try something out, it doesn't work. And it might take you a year to know it doesn't work. And then try another thing out. It might take 6 months to see if you can get it to work. So this makes it sound like it's a smooth process, but it's really not at all. It's a very, like any innovative process, it's quite bumpy and lots of learning and dead ends. But if you persevere, as we did, and you're lucky, you can get some stuff to happen. So we began to look for what was the right platform for diffusing this particular social innovation. And we tried social networks, we tried faith-based groups, we tried service clubs, we tried workplaces, and we tried neighborhoods. And what we discovered was that it worked in all of those categories. However, when we got to the neighborhood, we found ourselves able to achieve a result that we were unable to get in any other. Before I go into that result, let me tell you one of our key pieces of information, because this will help you understand the numbers that we got. Some of you may know, how many of you know Everett Rogers? Any of you know his work? 1, 2. That's about right. So Everett Rogers is one of the gifts that California gave the world. He was based in Stanford. And he is a social science researcher, and his research was how you spread new ideas or new innovations. And he wrote a book called Diffusion of Innovation, based on 1,500 case studies over 50 years on how new seed strains spread, or how new technology spread, or how new medicine spread. And what he found was that there were 4 categories of people that respond to an innovation. The first group he called early adopters. I'm sure you know that term, because California is an early adopter state. Many parts of Northern California are early adopter models. And he said early adopters have 2 characteristics. They seek out the new, and they have a high tolerance for experimentation. You don't have to work hard to find them. They'll find you. The next group he called the early majority. They are the belongers. They'll come along after the individuals in the early adopters category prove something. The third group he called the late majority, who eventually come along. And the last group he called the laggards, who will never come along. What he found was that if you get about 15% of a population, 15% of the blocks in a neighborhood, or 15% of the people on a block to take up this innovation, if the innovation is capable of going to scale, and many aren't, but if it's capable of going to scale, you hit a tipping point or it begins to diffuse on its own momentum. So whatever Rogers basically said was preach to the choir. They'll sing loud enough to get everyone into the church. And further, what he found was that most people had this concept called, don't preach to the choir. Preach to the laggards, who in fact are the least receptive and won't take up the innovation. And then what we discovered was people would say people aren't willing to change. So one of the conclusions that I got out of this research was people are willing to change if you are skillful in designing the intervention. And the change agents are actually the ones who have to become more skillful. So with that context, what we began to discover was that there was an opportunity to work with this process at the neighborhood level that gave us benefits that we were unable to get in any of the other platforms. And that was the co-benefits of getting to know your neighbors and improving the quality of life on your block. Real-time, immediate return of investment of time, as opposed to long-term benefits of doing the right thing to the environment. And so through lots of trial and error, we developed this script. Hi, I'm your neighbor from up the street. You knock on your neighbor's door, which is a revelatory thing for many people, to have their neighbor knock on their door and not sell them something like, their favorite religious value system or some political thing that they want or some money. Just really, I want to do something for the good of our block and our neighborhood and our world. I'd like to invite you to a neighborhood gathering at my home to hear about a program sponsored by, and then you'd have the city's name, like City of Davis. It's this Thursday night, 7:30 to 9. The program's goal is to help us get to know each other better as neighbors, do the right thing for the sake of our children, and improve the quality of life on our block. Can you make it? What we found was that about 85% of the people who heard that, well into the late majority, those benefits were such that they said yes. About half those people came. Of the people who came, about 75% joined, and we were getting a 25% recruitment rate on a block, which is really unheard of. And we felt like we had figured out how to break Gordian knot around community organizing. It was the co-benefits. It was meeting a multiple set of needs that individuals were unable to meet in other ways. It was not just about the environment. And it was deep enough so that it could really tackle a large percentage of people's needs. Further, we found that we could do this not only in Portland, Oregon, but in Kansas City, Missouri, or in Columbus, Ohio. We were able to get people who were not early adopters, by virtue of the benefits that we were able to generate, to pay attention. So we had answered the third question, how do you scale this? And we began discovering that we could scale this in neighborhoods and in many, many cities, not taking it to scale where we'd get large percentages of the city. That was going to come later. But scaling it in the sense that we had a replicable, scalable model. We started finding we also began to have an impact in the larger culture. We started finding that the media was really responding. This is my favorite Ed Koren quote. We ultimately enrolled him later on to be our cartoonist. Please help us reduce our garbage and improve our energy efficiency, our water quality, help us become eco-wise, and above all, empower others. So we were very proud that we made it to the New Yorker. So over the course of time, we built out a number of programs. One thing that I want to share with you, because of what's going on right now with all the DOE funding that's going into retrofits, is a specialized application of this program to see if you can get home energy retrofits furthered through this process. Because I've been working with a lot of the cities now that are attempting to engage citizenry around this issue, and it's quite a struggle. And we had one community that we began to work with, and we began to see if we could get some kind of traction on this program. We were discovering that people were doing these actions, but we had never really studied to see what kind of impact it had on retrofits. So as it turns out, we worked with the city of San Antonio, who wanted to just pilot this with its own employees. We worked with some 19 of their 40 city departments. We had 88% of their employees participate who attended the information meeting, so a really great take-up. We formed 27 eco-teams, so relatively small sample size, but a very, very interesting result. We found that without any prompting on our part, we got 41% of the people on eco-teams to do some level retrofit in their homes. And that was quite remarkable, based on what we were seeing as the take-up for retrofits at 1% or 2% from the number of people enrolled. So that was exciting. We then began to unpack why was that happening, and we discovered the team member demonstrations and technical assistance. This is a great quote. The topic leader demonstrated how to retrofit his home. Those that did not feel they had the skills to do this action were offered help by team members, and most of the team did it. So having that peer support system, having that technical assistance got people over the edge. Another one was the sustainability ethic. We built a new social norm on these teams. Again, the quote, our utility, CPS, gave out free thermostats and most of us entered it to 78. The team was helpful to get people to do it. We also went to CBS as a team to take advantage of their retrofitting program around weather stripping our homes and putting in energy efficient windows. Most of our team took these actions. So it shows you some of the potential for what this program can do in a very targeted way. Over the course of time, some of the cities we worked with said, you know, this social methodology seems to be very helpful around the sustainability issue, but can we use it also to tackle some of our livability issues? And one of those cities was the city of Philadelphia. And they were struggling with many, many issues, including having the highest crime rate, in the murder rate actually at that point in time in the country, having blighted neighborhoods, urban flight. And they wanted to see if we could actually translate this into helping improve these blocks where literally tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars were spent with very little traction. So we built a program, we customized it, we called it the Livable Neighborhood Program, we customized it to the city of Philadelphia. We called it about making life better on the street where I lived. And what we found was, based on 101 blocks, that instead of getting a 25% take-up, we got a 63% take-up of all the people on the block. On average, they took 3 neighborhood improvement actions, and this was in approximately a 2-month period. We were able to integrate, and this is the monocultural thinking idea, into sort of a more diversity approach. We had 25 different city or state agencies integrating their actions, their services into all the different actions. So we were able to, from the consumer point of view, to have them receive one initiative that had all their different needs met. We found that through the volunteer work that was done, we were able to get about a $4,500 volunteer time contributed per block. And we threw in the energy piece because we'd gotten some resources from the Department of Energy. And we were able to get these households also to reduce their energy use by 12%. And these are low-income households. So we got very positive reviews from the mayor, from someone from the University of Pennsylvania who was researching it, and from our project manager. So we saw that this methodology could scale beyond just sustainable lifestyles. The third application I want to share with you before I get into low-carbon diet and the larger agenda that we're working on, because these are all building blocks to this reinvention process. The city of New York asked us post 9/11 if we could help build more disaster resiliency in the city. And so we built a program, which we called All Together Now, which is Neighbors Helping Neighbors Create a Resilient New York City. And we worked with approximately 5,000 people in total, but 1,500 directly with this program. We got 11 actions taken, distinct actions to deal with any kind of emergency. 68% recruitment rate from the people that went to these information meetings. And the key behaviors that people were taking that were desired by the Office of Emergency Management. So I share all that with you because, and some of the feedback from all the participants in the program, because I want you to see the application. This social technology, this behavioral change framework has wide implications once it's starting to be deployed. So what is it that allowed it to work? I call this the DNA source code. So the keys that we discovered from all of this research over these couple of decades was, first of all, the right size group. 5 to 8 households allows for people to feel connected and personal enough so that you feel a relationship. It's not 30 people, it's not 20 people. Every single person can have a conversation with every other person. And you can exchange ideas, you can inspire each other. The peer support system is very powerful. Ease of use. We broke it into modular topics and action recipes. And an action recipe is very different than a checklist. An action recipe is like cooking a meal. First you do this, then you do this, then you do this. As opposed to just do this and somehow hope that people will translate that. So anytime you throw in a website, anytime you throw in something where you have to diverge from the path that they're on, it's a barrier. And it shows up as, I'll get to that later. And then the game's over. They don't often get to it without the peer support group and the process. It's so easy not to do this. It's so hard to do this. So you need everything working in the favor of the individual. The third thing is moving from a group of people that come together and turning them into a team where there's cohesiveness. So they create team purpose statements. They create team leaders. They share responsibilities. The group starts to move into a cohesive entity where accountability can start to be generated, which moves us to the third part, or the next part, fourth part. We built a group process protocol. And the group process protocol was built around a peer support system, accountability, and feedback. I say that I'm going to do this, and the next meeting I show up and I've either done it or I haven't. If I haven't done it, I have to face my friends, my neighbors, my coworkers. And by the way, when I say I'm going to do it, I'm also probably going to motivate other people to do it. So there's a lot of positive reinforcement, peer pressure, peer support. Very critical. A very coherent group process protocol. And we built an expectation of performance. This is not a discussion group. This is about performance. Lowering your carbon footprint by 5,000 pounds. Living a more sustainable lifestyle where there's real metrics and real outcomes. So part of that was structured meeting agendas and an expectation of performance. So what we found is that when people followed the structure, 95% of the teams completed the program, achieving substantive behavior change, and many of the teams replicated very organically and naturally because they had success. So one of the things that began to grow out of this experience, some of you may know, any of you know the book Where Good Ideas Come From? Any of you read that book? Put it on your list. It's fantastic. The Natural History of Innovation. And this guy talks about how in the natural world, innovation generates from all kinds of interesting ways that connectivity happens. But one of the more important ideas of the different frameworks that he put out about how innovation happens in the natural world was something he called the adjacent possible, which he calls the pattern of innovation in natural and social systems. And I'll read this to you because I think it's important for those of you that want to do social innovation or are doing it. He says, think of a house that magically expands with each door you open. You begin in a room with 4 doors, each leading to a new door you haven't visited yet. These 4 rooms are the adjacent possible. The path of evolution is a consistent exploration of the adjacent possible. So we set out to achieve behavior change and community engagement. And these were some of the rooms that opened up. And I want to speak to each of these rooms because there's huge potential to fully develop these rooms. And as policymakers, I think they have significant value to you. So let me start with the first one, green economic development. What we started finding was that the Green Living program started creating demand for green goods and services. We started creating demand for green businesses. We started creating demand for green jobs. We started creating demand for a green economy. It was a demand-side driver in the system. The piece that's often missing, if not always missing, because everything is usually looking at how to get the supply side. So we started finding, unbeknownst to us, it was certainly not something we intended to do, was that we became a driver of demand for green economic development. That was one of the doors that opened up to us. Once we understood that, we then began to look at how to do that more skillfully and more deliberately. Another one was that as teams came together, they got connected. They started learning how to cooperate. They started collaborating. They started really co-creating, and we built community. So we started finding we were generating an immense amount of social capital. That was a huge asset that the community could begin to redeploy if we knew how and if we had a vision for how to deploy that. So social capital, which is such a high value, often misunderstood and limited, with limited understanding of how to actually create it. But once you've got it, it's a huge asset. That's what the city of Philadelphia began to ask us to do, was build that social capital to improve the livability of their neighborhoods. It's what allowed for disaster-resilient communities to be born in New York City. It's this connectivity. Third thing we started discovering was that we were generating not just groups of people, but high-performance teams, teams that were actually performing at a very high level. I mean, think about what they were achieving. Substantive behavior change, 95% completion rate. We were building accountability skills. We were building team building skills, coaching skills, facilitation skills, visioning skills. That's a huge asset, again, that a community has that can be redeployed. And the next one was social innovation. People began to assess and educate themselves and act and collaborate. Huge numbers of new ideas were generated. If I had more time, I could spend a whole hour just telling you about all the social innovations that got generated by these teams. You bring these people together, you create this kind of connectivity, you set the vision, you set the goals, and things can happen. And you had socially engaged citizens. Block leaders transformed into program coaches, into political advocates, and on and on. So I want to close here by just sharing briefly where we took this. So 2006, I reissued my book, Low Carbon Diet. Al Gore helped popularize it a bit through having all of his evangelists that were doing a slideshow give it out to he gave it out to all of them, and they began to popularize it in communities all across the country. And before we knew it, we had a bunch of communities. The idea behind the low-carbon diet is to calculate your CO2 footprint, understand your baseline, choose from the 24 actions. Each of them has a number associated with it, so you know what your footprint number is per action. And then you use the eco-team for motivation and support. The meeting process is first the team building meeting where we connect, then people work on lifestyle practices, then their household systems, and then empowering others. So 4 meetings following the structures we've talked about. We then built this community engagement process called the Global Warming Cafe, or World Cafe process. Any of you familiar with the World Cafe? Getting more hands here. World Cafe is where groups come together to tackle issues that matter to them and to have discussions about them. So when you brought our recruitment model with the World Cafe model, we began to talk about the issue of climate change. And we began to ask people to talk about their fears and their hopes. And all of a sudden, we began to anchor it emotionally within people's experience. And they got emotionally engaged. It was quite powerful. And so they came together, they wrote down their fears and their hopes. We recorded it. You may notice in the bottom right-hand side that their hopes revolved around California initiatives as the tipping point for how we're going to tackle climate change. You're probably not surprised about that you have the pressure of the whole country waiting on your shoulders. So these were some of the results that we had gotten. What we found in our Portland pilot was that we got 22% CO2 reduction. They were hoping to get 10%. We got 22%. We found rather than 25%, we got a 41% block participation level. People felt the power of this issue. There was a moral imperative. It was more than just a need to do, a good thing to do. It was a need to do for people that really had that consciousness. We did some studies. We haven't done the formal studies that we did with the Green Living program, but what we have done from 2 groups that did studies. One was the Massachusetts Climate Action Network, working with 1,500 households, and Vermont Power and Light, interfaith group, that they were getting an average 25% CO2 reduction. So pretty close to 25% without really any strong prompting on our part. Hundreds of global warming cafes were organized, and some 300 communities have participated across the country. and tens of thousands of people, and many, many different countries around the world. So based on that, what we concluded was that we had something. But what we were also discovering was that we were going an inch deep and a mile wide. Communities needed more help to actually get this off the ground than we were giving based on just the program and the basic training that we were giving. So we began to build a model called the Cool Community Model, which was a whole system model, bringing together local government, local business, and local community groups, each getting to start a number of eco-teams. And then from there, growing out into the community to get the larger numbers. So this is what it looks like if you try to take a cool community to scale. So an example is a 100,000 person community. This happened to be the community of Berkeley, which is 100,000. 2.5 people per household means there's about 40,000 households in the population that you could possibly work with. If you were to get 85%, that is all the way up to the late majority, not counting the laggards, you'd have 34,000 households. If you divided by 8 households per eco-team, it meant that you had 4,250 eco-teams, which is the maximum, not necessarily what is achievable, although it's possible. And if you were to divide that by 50, what we found with our global warming cafes was that you could almost pretty easily form 10 to 15 eco-teams per cafe if you had enough people gathered. So with that number, if you did that over 3 years, you began to realize that if you got 85 partner groups, neighborhood groups, businesses, service clubs, faith-based groups, you could get there just on the organized parts of the community. And if you enhance that with the unorganized parts of the community where you do the block-by-block organizing, you begin to see a path forward for how you could begin to scale it. You take the overwhelm of numbers and you break it down. So what the process then looks like from the how point of view is these 5 steps. And again, I'm taking a very complex set of activities and trying to simplify it. The starting point is you need the baseline. If you don't know the footprint of your community, you don't understand the impact. Most communities don't organize themselves by the residential sector, so they don't actually know the residential sector's footprint. But when you do, you start to discover that it's significant, anywhere from 50 to 90%. And then it creates momentum and motivation, because now you understand that citizenry can be a huge part of the solution, and it's a driver on many other levels around political advocacy and green economic development. Then the second part is it's not about starting a few eco-teams, it's about envisioning the end state, the impact at scale. So what would happen in Davis if you had 75% of the community organized in eco-teams economically? What would happen in terms of the social quality of life? What would happen around livability, resiliency? What would happen in terms of carbon reduction, the economic development opportunities? And you begin to build out the possibility so you can engage people to go on this journey, which requires literally a reinvention process. We're not organized for this. Cities aren't organized for this. Then you need to integrate into existing activities. That is to say, every community is going to have tons of stuff going on, and the key is to get the synergies. So you begin to connect the dots. So what's going on? What can we build on? So again, because I'm in visit here with Davis, so the Cool Davis Initiative has many, many activities. How do we integrate each of them so they get connected and build into this larger strategy? It's about building synergy. Synergy as an accelerator of social change. And then the fourth part, the part that's often missed and probably the most difficult, is mastering the form. There is a very significant number of activities that have to be learned to do this well, to get this to actually be achieved. So we have to really do a deep dive to help people really understand how to master the form of this organizing model and this behavior change model. But if they do, and we've done this enough times, you can achieve significant results. But it doesn't just happen by virtue of having some concepts. You actually have to work on it, iterate, practice, practice, practice. And if you do, you can get these results. They're replicable and they're scalable. And the last is to measure. So what kind of an impact are we getting, and iterate. It can take 3 years to get something, 5 years, a new social innovation. So you've got to put all those pieces together. So to conclude, we are choosing to do that. Right now, we are setting ourselves our next great challenge. We call it the Cool City Challenge. And what we're trying to do is literally reinvent our cities to achieve dramatic carbon reduction, vibrant livability, and green prosperity. And that's the challenge that we're now out here to work with a number of our communities around. So simply, we're working with we plan to be working with 3 American cities, 3 Brazilian cities. We're calling them teaching cities. Our minimum goal is 25% participation of citizens and 25% carbon reduction. We want to get a minimum of 40% retrofitting their homes. We've already achieved those goals. We want to build the green economic development engine around this. We want to reinvest the social capital into livability and resiliency. And we want to, and this is the big stretch, we want to see if we can get these communities to become carbon neutral by 2025. Effectively, what we're doing is building the Everest Base Camp for the big ascent, which is carbon neutral cities. So this is a big idea. We want to design it as a whole system solution. We want to research it so that we understand what has worked, what hasn't worked, so we can disseminate it and scale it. Our plan is to launch it, announce it this June in Rio +20. And then we want to, in June 2016, disseminate it at the Olympics so that we can really get the world to pay attention. So let me close. Thank you for your attention. A lot of content. Again and again in history, some people wake up. They have no ground in the crowd, and they move to broader, deeper laws. They carry strange customs with them. They demand room for bold and audacious action. The future speaks ruthlessly through them. They change the world. That's what we are attempting to do. So thank you for your attention. And I have time for some questions if you have any. Please.
Right. Excuse me. Do I need this? Can everybody hear? Okay. Is it on? Okay, good. My name is Suzanne Reed. I'm Chief of Staff for Senator Carol Liu. We're attempting something in our district to bring communities and the business community, the education community together to spread the sustainability message as well as activities. When we started our program, one of the initial questions we had was what defines sustainability, what defines green? Did you go through this process of trying to, when you're describing your goals, what does it look like, what does it feel like, when are we there, and what are the metrics that we can use to measure our progress?
Well, sustainability, as everyone has come to learn, is very elusive because it can mean anything to anybody. And if you bring in social as well as the economic, along with environmental, it can be very hard to measure. One of the things that we've discovered with working with the carbon issue is it is measurable, and there are metrics. And if you also start to put social capital in, that's another metric you can use. I think the sustainability issue is a very difficult one to put metrics around. I don't think there's any easy way to deal with that. But what we were doing, when you break it down to the individual level, was we were looking at resource efficiency. So solid waste reduction, water efficiency, energy efficiency. So if you, talking at the residential level, there are ways to measure that. If you put that in relationship to cities' goals for solid waste reduction, you can begin to measure it against that metric, or water efficiency or energy efficiency. If you just have the larger sustainability name, you're going to probably get lost in that one, as most cities have, because it's really hard to know what to do with that. I might add, it's still worthy of having it as an aspiration, but it's hard to put metrics around it.
Yeah, this is sort of a follow-up to that, sustainability, sort of the argument between conservation, efficiency. I was at a water meeting, this was a while ago, but an older gentleman got up, he must have been 80 or 90, and he talked about, back in World War II, that we had rationing of gas, meat, whatever. This is before my time, I'm not sure exactly how it worked, but he said, back in the day, he knew what they were doing, why they were doing it, where that was going. But today, it was a water meeting. They said, if you want me to use less water, if you want me to let my grass go brown, okay, but where is it going? And sort of the idea, I may conserve, but statewide, are we really conserving? If I just let my grass grow brown or I turn my furnace up and I'm uncomfortable, and that just means you can build a strip mall somewhere deep in the Inland Empire or something, are you better off just having a green a green lawn? How do you respond to some of those questions?
I mean, he's got a really great question. I mean, when we first started designing our program, we found that as we were doing our core research, people were asking 4 questions. Where do I start? Which are the important actions? How do I do them? And if I did them, would it make a difference? And we had pretty good answers to the first 3, but the 4th one we didn't have a good answer. So what we realized was we had to build a bucket that showed that your drops were filling it rather than just being a drop in the bucket. So that's the key to building a coherent whole system solution, which has a very solid feedback system. So without a feedback system, without a clear sense of where it's all going, it's very difficult to get anyone to pay attention, like he mentioned. And with the whole notion of the sort of the freeloader mentality of if I do my part but others don't do their part, why should I bother? You've got to address those. And the key is a feedback system. And making it a small enough, block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, community by community, so you can really manage the size. That's the way we've addressed that issue. It's a very important issue. It's a critical issue, in fact, because otherwise people will just default to, why bother? I don't make a difference.
Is it on? Doug Grant. I've read your book. I haven't handed it out to very many people. I give presentations on climate, and I always try to give my audiences an action, what to do next. But when I leave, I don't know if they did it or not. So my question to you is, what are you asking us to do? I'm looking around the crowd here. These people came here for a reason, like me. We're passionate about something. So I don't know what the action is, but maybe we get together and we take this, whatever we decide is what we can implement. So I'm asking you, what would you like us to do individually or as a group?
I did not plant that question. But it's my favorite possible question to be asked. So let me have some fun thinking about this for a moment. I don't want to cut you short or undervalue your potential here. Well, minimally, I think everyone should start an eco team and go on a low-carbon diet. Reduce your carbon footprint if you haven't already. Minimally measure your footprint with Cool California. I mean, that's a given. What I've learned is there's a big gap between I know and I do. In Portland, we found that a lot of people were having this wonderful insight. We had this wonderful insight into people when they weren't acting. They said, I thought about it, therefore I did it. So knowing and doing are 2 different things. So obviously, inspiring you to want to actually lower your carbon footprint, measure it, low-carbon diet is a great tool. But larger than that, you have leverage here. So what's your leverage? So I wrote a book called Social Change 2.0, which is how you do the bottom-up, how you engage citizenry from the bottom up. That's what you've learned. But your core competency is top-down, passing legislation, regulatory interventions, financial incentives. The conversation we had before this meeting was how do you blend social change 1.0 and 2.0? So knowing what you heard today, how can you begin to integrate this into your policymaking would be my question. I think that would warrant the potential for a group to come together to start asking those questions. And maybe you want to convene such a group, or there's a call for people that want to look at that. How do you bring the 2 worlds together? We have to think more creatively and synergistically. So, I mean, that would be a core competency that you already have that you could build on. That's the conversation we've already seeded, and we're having a meeting afterwards to take that a little further. Is there anything else that you might see that you think you guys could do that I haven't even thought of, or that you think you guys may be capable of that I have not seen?
Actually, I have to apologize. I came about 15 minutes late because I have a meeting I'm preparing for at 1:30. So I missed the very beginning. But I would like to get this, I'd like to get the names and emails and work individually in our communities.
And there's many people seeing this via webcast, so maybe there can be a community practice that starts to happen. Maybe there can be an email that goes out, and anyone who wants to be part of that can, is that possible?
It is possible, but they are viewing.
Great.
Pierre DeVere at the California Energy Commission. I got a little bit of a follow-on to Suzanne and Rob's points. You mentioned that carbon's measurable, and I'm kind of curious how far your teams go on the issue of life cycle, because you take a simple example, are you going to use paper plates or a clay dish? And depending on the, for what you have to wash the dish, what your electricity of your provider is, if it's all coal, it's one thing, if it's hydro, it's another. Where's the pulp coming for your paper plate? And if it's the Amazon rainforest, it's got one footprint. And getting access to supply chain information is really challenging. So there's no real clear answer. It's like the paper and the plastic thing, which is better for the environment. And unless you really get into life cycle and you have the availability of the information, a paper plate may be, less of an impact, lower GHGs than, using clay dishes and going through the dishwasher. So I'm kind of curious how far you go down the life cycle.
Well, great question, and one that I would expect from this group, so thank you for upholding my expectation of this particular group of thoughtful people and intelligent people around this issue. We tend to not get caught up in that issue because it tends to be really a side issue. 80% of the issues you can get pretty clear information on. For the 20%, it's somewhat around the margins. The more important issue is to raise the carbon IQ, if you will, and get people really starting to move on a sustainable lifestyle path or a low carbon lifestyle path.
Good afternoon, Kurt Malchow, California Natural Resources Agency, and I was really taken by Everett Rogers, the concepts by Everett Rogers that you discussed, where you have a critical threshold of communities that are planning, and that has its momentum. So we should focus more on fostering that and engaging that discussion more than just trying to deal with the people at the end of the spectrum. It seems that you're automatically trying to defend your case. We put out products that help facilitate climate planning. There's guidance, condensation of research into easily understandable impacts, but we're left, it's almost like we produce something, we have a store that we put it out, and there's no marketing mechanism for that. So with that, do you have any thoughts on ways we could better make local communities aware? I'm thinking that we have to somehow find a way or find and isolate those communities that are already actively planning and engage them at that critical moment. Do you have any additional thoughts that could help us out?
I think I'd have to know more details of the what of what you're doing, but I think you've got the key principle is to look for the early adopters who want to work with you. One of the key ideas about early adopters is they have a high tolerance for experimentation and they seek out the new. So they don't need it perfected. They'll work with you. And if you put out the challenge and say, look, we've got this, we need your help, who wants to work with us? And by the way, if you sprinkle a few dollars in there, that doesn't hurt either. But then you can work together. And again, some of these tools and some of these frameworks could be helpful in actually translating what you're doing into behavioral change.
Hi,
Chris.
This is Chris Jones from UC Berkeley. I guess I have to follow up on the life cycle question. Thanks for asking that. California is a real leader in thinking about life cycle assessment. We've done this with our low carbon fuel standard, and we're also doing it with the Cool California tools. Our assessments are the complete life cycle of everything a household or a business consumes, and so we really do look at the full spectrum. And that even does apply to energy and transportation. You've got to look at the full well-to-pump emissions and so forth. So I think that this is a really nice way for California to collaborate with your work, is to try to expand the full carbon analysis.
I think that would be exciting. I mean, I think where I would say our program is suboptimal. I think we realize that we've been able to make some good traction, but there's a lot of opportunity to take it further. So we would look forward to that collaboration. And I would look forward to the collaboration with any of you around the policy issues, because that's, again, a way to optimize it. You've got to get all the tools working together to maximize the potential. So, final question. 1, 2. Maybe we'll squeeze in 2.
Okay.
Muriel Strand, formerly of ARB. Looking at your categories, I'm seeing energy, I'm seeing water, and I'm thinking about the category of food. Very important. Some of it's residential, some of it's not, some of it's transportation, some of it's farming. But it's another slice that, I don't know, I just have a feeling it matters.
Well, food does matter. In the low-carbon diet, we have several actions on food. under lifestyle practices. So we clearly have put food in there, and in the Green Living Program we have a number of food-related actions. We put it in the category of energy or transportation. Those are the places where it shows up as impact. But yes, food is a very essential thing.
Mitch Sears with the City of Davis. This will be a very quick question. Are you speaking anywhere else in the region?
Well, just great that you asked that question. So tomorrow night, I am having a wonderful meeting facilitated by the Cool Davis Initiative and the City of Davis to talk about this and also talk about how to really take Davis to scale. So any of you that are available, I think it's at 6:30 at the City Hall. We'd love to have you. And I thank you all for your attendance, for your thoughtful questions, for the good work that you're doing. I wish you well with it. I really am looking to California as a source of great contribution, teaching, collaboration. So keep up your good work. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, David.
You're welcome. You're welcome. My pleasure. Thank you. Let's see how to take this thing out. I think I got it. Hi.
I'd love to communicate with you a little bit more.
Sure.
I stupidly went out.
I give you mine. Yeah. I think actually on the last slide you might see some.
Oh, hey, I didn't know you were here. What? I didn't know you were here. You were really?